Hey everybody, welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast. My guest on the podcast today is Andy Bibby, CEO of 87%. First up is a massive shout out to our partner William Wood Watches. Chances are you already know who William Wood Watches is, but if you haven't, you'll have seen them in GQ, The Times, Esquire, Forbes, The Telegraph, BBC, The Financial Times, Men's Health, upcycling firefighting equipment and utilising every single component that makes up the beautiful watches. They've won the Esquire Self-Made Entrepreneur of the Year. They were chosen by GQ Men's Health as the best men's watches to buy in 2020 and 2021. And they've donated over 50,000 to international firefighting charities. Now there's so many ways to go on and find out more about William Wood Watches. Head over to williamwoodwatches.com, check them out on their Instagram, check them out on their Facebook. They've got a private group if you are a member, if you have purchased one of their watches. So jump on over, take a look, whether it's the Triumph, the Valiant, the Bronze, the Chivalrous, and they've even got the Tunnel to Towers 911 watches. Honestly, if you are a fan of the emergency services, if you're looking for that gift for someone, whether it's a new recruit, whether it's retiree, get over to williamwoodwatches.com and take a look. I promise you will not regret it. Our second partner of the podcast for today's episode is the incredible Hikes. Hikes footwear is made in Europe and they are an innovative, high-tech, functional shoe manufacturer, and they meet the highest standards all over the world. They cater for the fire and rescue, the medical, workwear, police, military, forestry, streetwear, from our tactical frontline special forces operators to our firefighters' boots on the ground. Hikes are keeping us safe in every single way. As part of their partnership with the podcast, they are giving away a pair of Hikes boots every single month. So after the podcast, be sure to jump over to our social media feeds, have a look for that post, get yourself on there. We have given away 3 pairs so far. We are doing it every single month, so get over there, check it out. There is no funny details to be had, so jump on over, check it out. Hikes UK, a fantastic partner of the podcast. Today's a really interesting episode for me personally, as we are delving deep into the state of mental well-being on the front line. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's buckle up for safety, and I will see you crazy cats on the other side. Andy Bibby, welcome to the Firefighters Podcast. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, good. Good, really good today. Nice because the sun is shining.
It's nice to, it's nice to get that little bit of time as well. We've trying to get this together for like the past few weeks since we first sort of met at the Emergency Services Show. Yeah,
that's right. We really had a good time, actually. People that were there really wanted to be there, so we actually found the quality of the show really good. We were very happy, and it was great to meet you.
What really sort of drew me to the work that you guys are doing, because you were sort of featured as one of the speakers on the date. So I'll sort of just capture as to how we first sort of met. So you are CEO of 87%, and your company recently completed an 18-month-long study of over 10,000 frontline workers, which is massive, highlighting the critical state of poor staff mental health across the emergency services sector. Now, this was entitled The State of Mental Wellbeing on the Frontline. However, as we know and as we're going to talk about today, this isn't just a frontline issue. It's estimated, and this is a crazy statistic when I was reading it in your thing, that it's estimated that UK employs up to 45 billion a year, and it's the leading cause of work-related ill health. That is just a mind-boggling number.
Yeah, Deloitte has been doing some research around this. They put out some data in 2017. They actually updated it in January 2019, right as the pandemic, January 2020, just as the pandemic was taking hold. And they were actually finding that those numbers were worsening by a few percent. And that's even before we got to the pandemic. And so we really, as an organization, our reason to be, our mission is to improve the mental well-being of society percent by percent. And so we're really looking right across all of the critical areas of what that is. And clearly emergency services critical for us, and even more now, given what we've gone through over the past 18 months, and I suspect we'll rumble on for a good while yet. So, it's been very interesting work that we've been able to do. But, so we work right across a gamut from normal creative organization through professional services into the NHS and frontline workers, right across all of them. And actually, we find a lot of similarities, even though they work in very different sectors. And while commercial organizations look at pounds and pence. Non-commercial organizations, government-based organizations, they have the same need for productivity, for people to be happy and rewarded at work. And that's really, when it all boils down to it, that's really what we're trying to focus on, because the organization, any organization, will benefit if the people within it are well looked after. And I'm in my own organization. I want to be well looked after. So, I want to be happy at work. I want to have a good life balance. So why wouldn't we try and figure out as many things as we can to make that happen? That's really what we're trying to do.
When I was listening to you at the show, I think it's how you and the team have sort of really wonderfully been able to articulate this aspect of well-being, because I think, and I'm going to say this just because it feels right, that for some people that still feels like a punchline. They don't fully see it as a key performance indicator, because it is a very difficult thing to measure. I did just want to just finish off by saying, obviously you are part of the wider team. It was Dr. Sarah Pitts, who is your clinical director and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. So there's some big acknowledgements and there's a lot of sort of drivers behind this. But I wanted to start, when we're talking about that well-being, that in this study you speak about the sort of 7 dimensions of well-being. Now, could you briefly expand on what they are and how they play a role in our well-being?
Yes, we really, when we first looked, and we started the organization in 2017, Sarah, as you rightly say, is our clinical director and was our first employee. What we really wanted to understand was the full holistic well-being. We believe that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. We definitely want to improve mental well-being, and we know that we bring our whole selves to work, and we have our whole selves at home. So we did a lot of work. We actually looked at about 120 years worth of research coming out of the World Health Organization, out of the British Psychological Society, clearly, and looked at and wanted to establish, okay, what is a comprehensive way to measure mental well-being? And so we had the 7 dimensions. So the 7 dimensions: body, quality of life, self-esteem, growth, emotions, and relationships. And then we actually broke those down into sub-dimensions so that we could really get a full picture. And so we have 35 data points that somebody goes through, but it means that they can 35 is a little bit too much for you to sort of get your head around. But 7 I can kind of figure out and I can see. And we did a lot of work actually in 2018, external clinical validation, we took it to 22 experts, looked at how did that resonate. And then we spoke to a lot of people who went through our initial measure. And we know that, one, it resonates. So people who go through the assessment goes, yeah, I recognize this. This is me. And so that's good. And then from there, we sort of establish how you may want to think about your health in a way that people feel comfortable with, really similar to physical health. Physical health is much better understood in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Mental health is actually still catching up. People still think about mental health as mental ill health, and it's quite binary. People kind of feel like, okay, if I'm not ill, I'm okay. Well, in physical health, you don't say, well, if I'm not in the hospital or going to the doctors, then I'm okay. No, you need to work on your fitness, and you've lots of things that enables you to do. I know that when I feel on top of the world, I can do anything. I can achieve my goals. I can go after things, and it makes me feel great. And we want people to understand how to get those feelings on a regular basis.
You spoke about growth.
And some of it is physical health.
As one of the aspects of dimensions. Now, growth is something that because I do see a lot of crossover when I used to look at companies like Gallup and stuff like that, and they predominantly would measure specifically from like a business perspective, engagement. But there is a lot of crossover, for people who are still perhaps stuck in an older mindset, and they desperately need to see these key metrics. So things such as growth. I mean, let's just jump into that one. Why? How do we sort of acknowledge that? How do we measure it? How do we sort of discuss somebody's level of growth and or their ability to grow in an organization?
Yeah, so we break down growth into sort of 4 areas. We look at motivation and perseverance, focus and attention, curiosity and learning, creativity and flexibility. So we know that people have various levels of creativity. I'm not the most creative necessarily a person in the world, but I know it's about helping people understand their strengths, and I know where my strength is, so that you can know how to think about your career, or are you in the right career? Is there something that you're adaptable to? Because when you're in the right job and you're loving what you do, growth actually is just happens.
Yes.
Because you're sort of, it's just natural. So we're really helping people see and figure out. I actually went on a course, back in my 20s, with Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yep.
And one of the questions that he asked was, if you weren't at work, what would you be doing? And a colleague of mine said, I'd be playing the saxophone. He loved the saxophone. And so Stephen asked him, well, why aren't you doing that as a job? And I think so. A month later, he resigned and became a professional musician. Now, I'm sure that's not what my employer was thinking about when they sent them on the course. But actually, what he did was he discovered his passion, and he said, you're right. And we just know that when we fit in that area and we have a passion, and this is something that we see actually in all of the things that concerned us in some of the research that we did. One of the things that absolutely stood out for people who work in the emergency services is they are passionate about what they do. They care about what they do, and they're there for a reason. And that was one of the areas, and that I think is why they put up with some of the pressures of the job, because they genuinely care about what it is that they do. And so that's sort of that growth area, and just helping people get to that piece where they feel good about what they're doing.
I don't necessarily want to jump forward in something that I was thinking of for a later part of the conversation, but when you said there about people wanting to pursue something different to perhaps what they're already doing now, I wanted to sort of zoom in on the aspect of, like, have you heard of investment bias? Like if somebody has been in a career for 10 or 15 years, or they've invested in a relationship, or even the gambling analogy, I've put £30 on the blackjack, I'm not going until I win it back. If people have been in a career for 15 years, now the emergency services and also frontline workers as a whole, even the military and the work that we're doing all over the world, the roles have changed. There's many aspects of these roles that have changed. So if somebody has been in it for 10, 15 years, and now, they're feeling that ache or that pang or that growing discomfort with something that has changed, or their relationship with it, because also they've changed, they're at a different stage in their life.
Yeah.
How do we answer that? And I know I'm not necessarily asking you for an answer, but that can be a barrier for people who may feel like they've invested so much time in a career that if they're no longer getting that level of fulfillment, or it is having a detrimental effect on their well-being, it could be very difficult for people to either adjust, change, stay, leave, what they've been so used to.
Change is scary. And we know that. And actually, I am not a clinician, but I'm fortunate that I'm surrounded by some of the best clinicians in the country. And I'm learning all of the time. But change is scary. We know that actually well-being suffers when any organization goes through a lot of change. And particularly if that change is constant, then people will often leave just because they can't cope with all of the change. And there's a lot of organizations that then will invest in how to cope with change. And we do work a lot with our clients on coping with change.
Is there a fact that we call it change, though? We call it, sorry to interrupt you, I just feel that bursting in me, because I feel like now, with the constant collision of innovation, technology, changes in political drives and all this sort of stuff, the only constant is change now. Because without change, we're going to have no progress. And The population's constantly expanding. The demand on the emergency services in the front line is getting a heavier weight. How do we change people's perception of change? And because people always say, especially with the emergency services, like I say for the fire service, there's two things they hate. They hate the way it is and they hate change. You think,
right.
You paint yourself into a bit of a corner sometimes with people, but how can we reframe that? Because why don't we just see it as progress? Why is even you and I speaking now? Why is our common vernacular that we call it change? Why don't we call it progress?
Yeah, I like to think about, so the way in which I think about change or the way in which I've been taught to think about change is to see change as an opportunity. And we will all have heard stories of people where change is forced upon them. Maybe they lose their job or something else happens in their life or whatever. And when they reflect on it, they go, oh, that was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was painful at the time, because it gave them that opportunity to explore different things. And actually, I think what we're seeing throughout the pandemic and what we saw in the hospitality industry, people were forced to find alternative ways to make a living. And actually what's happening now is that the hospitality industries and they're really struggling because a lot of people don't want to go back to that, because actually what happened is they found stuff that they were more passionate about, stuff that they really wanted to do, because that change was forced upon them. They were suddenly effectively out of work and at home, and they started to be creative and all of those things. So it's really about making sure, one is, we would always say, understand yourself, because, and make sure that you're in the right mindset for change. You wouldn't say, well, I'm going to run a marathon, and know that you'd want to make sure that you were in the right physical shape for that marathon. So you'd do a little bit of prep, you'd do some training, you'd make sure, but you would make that commitment. I think making a commitment to change is similar in terms of just making sure that you're right. And that's why we think about the measurement, the 7 dimensions. That's really about helping me as an individual just understand where my strengths and weaknesses are, and maybe some areas that I want to work on before I make that change. So it's all about sort of understanding yourself and embracing that. But change is generally, in my opinion, if you approach it right, is a very positive thing.
Absolutely. Now, there were so many interesting things, and I'm going to force us back into the discussion, because I know we'll go down a lot of rabbit holes. It's a good and a bad habit of mine, but I do love it, to be fair. One of the many interesting outcomes I read from the report was that female staff are more likely to have the difficulties of the physical health, whereas the male staff are more likely to have difficulties sharing these emotions. Now, I suppose viscerally, as a male and having struggled with things in the past and benefit from a lot of coaching and support, that does ring true to me. But the statistics were quite surprising. I don't know why I felt that way about it. But what were some of the findings that showed this? Because when I read it in the report and saw it, actually saw it on the paper, it kind of jumped out at me.
There's lots of research that our team has done around this, because it's clearly a really important for us to understand right across our client base. Generally, and there's some kind of historical role stuff happening here as well. Generally, women are really time poor, actually, particularly in the pandemic. They were probably balancing homeschooling with incredibly busy jobs. They may also be the primary sort of chef in the house. So actually fitting in time for themselves became really difficult because of the demand on their time. Men tend to need to feel strong. I'm the provider, even though that may not necessarily be true in their household. That emotionally, that's a stance that they generally take, and therefore opening up around some of their vulnerabilities can be difficult, because they feel emancipated in some way, or that they actually should be stronger than they are. We see a lot in society now, some of the breaking down of that piece, because it's okay to address that, but the research really showed And particularly in the pandemic, that's where it sort of, that sort of difference in the sexes became very, very apparent because of the pressure that the pandemic took us under.
I wanted to ask you next about stress. So people often speak about being stressed. It kind of walks hand in hand with so many aspects of life. But again, when we spoke earlier, the power that we give these words, we spoke about change earlier, and now we speak about stress. In my own personal experience, a healthy amount of stress is good, because stress physically, psychologically, is, we said principle, specific adaptation to an imposed demand is of people that do anything sort of physical. We will adapt to an imposed stress, and it'll often make us stronger. But stress, to a certain extent, can be damaging. But how does it differ when it becomes chronic stress? And how does that affect our bodies? Could you speak about the differences between chronic stress and general stress?
Yeah, and again, I'll talk about it from my perspective as a human being and what I've learned from the smart people around me. Stress is a very normal, good thing, and actually is a healthy thing for most of us. It helps. The body will put chemicals in. It will raise our awareness. It's a very positive thing. What happens, though, is when that stress becomes more constant, or when more regular, if you like, then actually your body doesn't have time to come down from that stress level. That's when it starts to get unhealthy, because you're now no longer able to recover from those areas, and that's when it becomes chronic. That's when you start to get burnout. That's when your body will actually start to physically shut down. Your brain will start to shut down. It's a physical thing. And that's why, because burnout, when you go into burnout, that's when you actually, you can't think straight, you can't organize right, you may not actually be able to get out of bed in the morning.
No.
Because it's overwhelming. And that's because your body has become overloaded and now needs to actually physically shut down to recover itself. And so we've got to notice in ourselves when stress is becoming unhealthy, and then be able to give ourselves a few things to be able to cope with it, so that you can go back into stressful situations. And particularly on the front line, you go into a lot of stressful situations.
Yeah, that's why it stood out so much to me, because I remember studying aspects of this when I first went into the sort of physical training world, and then when I've been in fire service now for sort of 13 years, it's kind of come full circle, because I remember looking at it simply from a chemical standpoint of your adrenaline, your cortisol, your norepinephrine, sort of like that, and I remember reading about these natural chemicals, stress, adrenaline, all that is good for us, but historically, it's supposed to be very short-lived, like you said about the dose rate that you're getting from this. So it would be engage. You find the saber-toothed tiger as outside your cave, and you go bang, massive surge of cortisol, massive surge of adrenaline. You either fight it, you freeze, you run away, you kill it, whatever it may be, and then you go. And the stress and the cortisol leaves your body, because that's a massive surge of adrenaline, of energy, and it doesn't come for free. And I remember reading, just from a physical standpoint, in order for it to do that, it shuts down your digestive system, because that's why we say somebody's poop scared, because you either poop yourself or you throw up. Because your digestive system uses up so much blood to keep you going, but it thinks, I don't need to worry about what's happening in 12 hours time. I need to worry about right now, this second, surviving. Shuts your digestive down. Doesn't worry about bugs, because you're not going to get a bug in the next 5 seconds. So it shuts down your defense system, your hair, your skin. Nothing grows or anything like that. But if we live in that constant state, it's a bit like we've gone from big spikes and surges, if we had it on a graph, to now like having a constant set point of like a drip feed in your arm of cortisol, and it's constantly switching things off. And this is when people say, my stressful job is making me ill, and you're like, well, yeah, because it's constantly pressing the button to switch off your defense system, to switch off your natural, your body's defenses. Oh, I'm so stressed, I can't eat, I can't sleep, because you're hyper aware, you're hypersensitive all the time. And then when I read it in that, it kind of gave me that deja vu, because I was like, yeah, you're right. We go into stressful situations constantly. And I'm just talking like stressful in the job. If you then factor in societal expectation. You know, you said about male, female, oh God, I'm supposed to be the breadwinner, I'm supposed to be strong, you know, I'm supposed to be an athlete, I'm supposed to be, you know, my wife's best friend, my husband's lover, the best chef, the best parent, all of this. And it just kind of rang true. And then when I said that the aspects of when you started speaking about burnout, sadly, it didn't come as a surprise.
No, it's a shame, and we see it not just in frontline, although I have to admit that it is more prevalent in the front line because of the work that gets done in emergency services, because of the situations we work with, the air ambulance, UK air ambulance, and
I saw in the study that paramedics were the highest suffering. Why is that?
Yeah, because certainly on the air, the situations they're going into, you know, when you jump in a helicopter and you're going to an accident, you know it's not because little Jimmy's fallen over and grazed his knee.
No.
You know, you're going into some of the most serious and life-threatening situations that will produce all of these, the adrenaline, and you'll have to be able to cope with that. And so we know that these areas within paramedics, etc., because of the situations they're in. Where we see it in sort of normal organizations is generally through bad management, actually, where you've got a boss that's constantly sort of creating these environments of stress for whatever reason.
Is there an aspect as well that they work alone a lot? Because I thought of this. We have an ambulance station directly opposite us, and my brother-in-law's a paramedic. He speaks about his shifts. They don't get the same level of rest that firefighters do. They go to a lot more incidents, not necessarily trauma-based, because obviously a lot of what we go to is trauma, but nonetheless, they're having a lot more doses of cortisol, just bring it back to that. But also they work alone. You know, firefighters and even some police officers, you tend to see them working in either pairs, or certainly firefighters work in a team of 4 or even more. And that aspect, to bring us back to what we are as animals, that aspect of social interaction and almost like pulling the pressure release valve through that, be it dark humor or just, you know, misery loves company, or you're sharing through the struggle, and you can all collectively see the light at the end of the tunnel. But if somebody's working alone all of the time, a lot of paramedics are, you know, a first response in their car on their own. Did that show itself in the data? I'm literally just talking from my own personal interpretation. I've no data to back this up other than what I see, and they tend to work alone all the time.
We didn't collect specific data around whether they were working in teams or not. We look at whether they're managers. We are actually starting to look at this, particularly for those people working at home, which I know is not necessarily emergency services, but you know, right across, because that loneliness aspect, we do see that paramedics and people who work in emergency services are twice as likely to feel lonely. And you do, particularly if you come out of a situation where perhaps you've seen things you didn't want to, it's good, as you say, to get that release almost immediately, because otherwise it sort of gets bottled up. Maybe when you go home, you don't get that opportunity to do that, and so that will build up over time. And we did see that. We saw 50% more likely to feel anxious, 20% more likely to feel depressed, and that will play out in certain situations. And we do a lot of work in you know, one of our dimensions is around relationships, and loneliness is a key part of that. But we also look at emotional support and understanding others. I think one of the key areas for people is understanding and spotting the signs in others, so that you can perhaps reach out and just that kind of, are you okay? Or even just, it's going to be okay, or just that little bit of human emotional contact can make an enormous difference to an individual who may be going through something which 99% of the time is going to be perfectly recoverable in a very short amount of time. But sometimes if they don't get that release, then it can build up, and that's when we see problems happen.
Is there a factor as well, because there's some less familiar terms that I read as part of the report, that certainly for me, and I think for other people, were worth sort of expanding on, because you spoke about the emotional support there, but something I read in the report was around the emotional exhaustion and compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
Great terms, and I think I understand them to an extent, but they sound quite worrying for people that also are potentially part of a family, or at least part of a social group. And that's just going to surely perpetuate that aspect of loneliness. Can you speak a little bit more around emotional exhaustion and compassion fatigue?
Yes, and we've been doing some very specific work actually with one of our clients that they're vets. Actually, it's a network of vets, and they see this. They're sort of, I think of them as almost like in another emergency service, and particularly during the pandemic. And they actually found that compassion fatigue, this constantly showing others emotion, and by the time they got home, they were out of emotion. And so that absolutely affects their relationships, because actually maybe their partner has been working at home all day and actually is really looking forward to that person coming home and having that energy. And so those dynamics get twisted when under these scenarios, you're spending all day just being really compassionate, and you forget about being compassionate to yourself, and then to those ones around you, that's important too. And the pandemic has certainly heightened that problem, and we now have some specific training modules that address some of these and allow people to understand how to get that balance back in their lives.
Balance is tough, though, in an ever-expanding workforce, or more specifically, the demand that's placed on that workforce. I wanted to ask you a little bit about resilience as well, because we've spoken, not negatively, I suppose, but we've spoken about many of the struggles that people are facing, but there's also something quite unique, and it's certainly something I experience as part of the podcast when we're interacting with people in the emergency services, is that they do demonstrate that sort of positive and proactive mindset, certainly in challenging situations. And you do reference in there this power of a positive mindset. That might be difficult for some people to engage with, because maybe they've heard the term used before, certainly in areas of personal development and stuff like that. How does that differ, or how are we using the term in this, and how do we try and cultivate and encourage that in people that some people might think is a bit wishy-washy, it's a bit high five? But I'm massive for the power of positive mindset, but it's something I've had to develop. It's not something I think came naturally.
I think that's right. And in the emergency services, I'll just highlight a couple of things. And 90% of people said that they enjoy finding solutions to new problems. They're faced with problems all the time. And that's actually part of what they really enjoy, this pride in their work. 85% believe there's a positive side to everyday challenges. I mean, that is exceptionally high, much higher than we would see in the normal population, right? Because these are people who are in this profession for a reason. And that does show resilience. What I would say is make sure that gets maintained, because you need that resilience. You talked about dark humor. That's really important part of that, sort of being able to get that energy out.
Just to give you a moment of levity sometimes as well. And reality. So we do a lot of work now. We really think about what are the simple things that you can do every day that fit into your life that will help you maintain mental well-being. The analogy I use is around physical health. And we know that physical health is about exercise and diet, and we know 10,000 steps and 5 a day. 10,000 steps and 5 a day have made a significant difference to societal health, because they're easy things to fit into my day. There are small changes that I can make in my day that I'm already doing, right? I'm already eating, so I can make a small change to make sure that I eat healthier food. That's great. I've not added something to my to-do list. I've just changed something. 10,000 steps? Yeah, I'm walking. I walk every day. So
I can just change some things. And we're really trying to find the same thing in mental well-being. And mental well-being is about self-awareness. And self-awareness is about self-reflection. If you have good self-awareness, you will be very mentally resilient. You will really understand, because you'll feel your emotions, you'll understand, and you'll be able to cope with those. You maybe take yourself out of a situation that you may not have been able to do. And we do. So we've been developing these little 2, 3 minute, 5 minute things that you can do to build self-awareness over time. Just like 5 a day or 10,000 steps, if you do it regularly enough, it will have a major effect on your life. So that's part of it, because when we looked at emergency services, we saw these are people who are exceptionally busy. They often don't have time, maybe for breakfast, maybe just for the basic things. And so if you put well-being on their to-do list, it won't get done, because it's not going to be something that is a priority in their day, because it's about me. And we do say self-care is not selfish, right?
Yeah.
So we've got that sort of piece. And we're trying to, but it's about recognizing that it's not about saying, hey, I need to do an hour's mindfulness or half an hour's meditation or whatever. That is good if you've got the time and if that's what you're into. Nothing wrong with that. But most people don't, or it's maybe not for them. I've tried it, it's not for me. But what I do understand is, over the last 4 years that I've been focusing on self-awareness, when I've become more aware of that as a tool, I and those people around me have noticed positive differences. But we think about, hey, look, 2 minutes every day, well, yeah, people go to the toilet, you've probably got 2 or 3 minutes there. You've got 2 or 3 minutes maybe on your commute home, walking the dog, lots of different areas where you can fit it into your day where it's not a chore. Because if well-being becomes a chore, it just never will get done. No. And you'll say, okay, well, I'll be okay, I'm okay, until suddenly, all of a sudden, you're not. What we want to do is give these people little things that they can do in that day just to raise self-awareness. And so the exercise and diet of mental health is self-awareness and self-reflection. And once you understand that concept, you will suddenly find that actually the day opens up a whole new opportunity for you to reflect without it having to be thing on your to-do list.
What's one of the exercises, for example, you say about some of the resources and or exercises, these small 2 or 3 minute things? I don't want to delve too much into it because I know a lot of this is available on the website and through the work that you do, but what would be an example of something that we are encouraging people to help them get that self-awareness, perhaps? Yeah,
we have something called Me in 3, so 3 minutes just for me, and we do 2 things. We ask some self-reflective questions that might be, how would you be in this situation, or how do you feel about, how many friends? Just asking you to reflect on one aspect of the 35 dimensions. No more than 3 questions. We don't care what the answer is. We only care that you think about the question, because thinking about the question changes the neural pathways in your brain, because your brain has already gone through the thought process once. Yeah. So when it comes into this situation again, whether you like it or not, your brain is actually going to react slightly differently, because brains are adaptive and they've got a little bit of knowledge. So we ask you 1, 2, 3 questions, and we ask you to reflect on the answer. So that's us asking you to reflect. And then we say, reflect on yourself by just saying, how are you on a score of 1 to 10? And look at that. We then help people look at that over time. Now, that does take 2 to 3 minutes. And the science shows if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, we would say sort of maybe 3, 4 times a week, minimum 3 times. If you do that 3 times a week over 3 months, you will notice a difference. I will absolutely guarantee it, because you will start to really understand a little bit more about what is causing your emotions to happen. You will grow self-awareness, and self-awareness is the secret to mental health.
you engage that sort of master problem solver, as you already alluded to, because your mind's already gone through the process. I remember hearing a great example of, I think it's Headspace. You're aware of the app Headspace?
Yeah, great organization.
Fantastic resource, yeah. And they gave a wonderful one. I've used it several times about the road analogy. Like you feel these emotions coming up on the horizon. Like you can feel anger. When somebody does something. And you're like, hey, Andy, that's annoying me now. I saw you do that, and you have a that little pilot light switches on in the background, and it starts to get a little bit of fuel and a little bit of fuel, and you can feel it getting closer to you. And like you said there about rethinking about something or having an almost sort of external view of it, because rather than being stood in the road and you see anger approaching you and approaching you and approaching you, and then as it grows and grows and grows to the point where you have your own fuse, as people would say, they run out and they just sort of go rah, and they just stand toe to toe with the car, and they're going to wrestle it and they're going to push hard against it, versus having that self-awareness, which is obviously sitting on the sidewalk and seeing it grow and grow and grow and go, isn't that interesting? Wow, that thing, that person, that environment, that situation is really causing me, or I'm allowing it to, something about it is forcing me to give it attention, and I am making that a sort of a conscious decision to engage with it. Whereas actually, you could see it approach and then just let it pass you by and go, wow, that was close, that was interesting. Had I have chosen to step out into the road, that I could have onboarded all of that trauma. I could have onboarded that stress, and I chose not to. And it's those aspects, even if you think you've already thought about this, it's the difference between standing in the middle of the road and standing on the side of the road. Is that am I fishing there, or is that kind of what we're talking about?
No, you're right, and so you choose then. What you want to do is give yourself the option, because sometimes anger, it's also a very natural and can be a very positive thing. It's when you can't control it, when you're not aware of it, that's when it becomes an issue, because it starts to get you into situations. I snap at my partner. And I didn't mean to, and then, that creates a situation. And so it's just it's really that self-awareness, and particularly in emergency services, really encourage people to spot those little times in the day when they can just reflect on themselves. As I say, self-care is not selfish, and it's actually important, and it's how we, how we grow and how we understand how to make the best out of situations.
I suppose there's something there as well about, because you said about the number of times that we do it and the number of times we practice self-awareness. So I'm hearing sort of an experience aspect there. And I suppose, and again, it's something I read in the study, that a lot of this comes with experience. And what's been really, I suppose, interesting about the last 18 to 24 months is the fact that we've had, as we always do have, we've had more and more people coming in as junior staff, fresh starters in the NHS, certainly in the fire service and in all emergency services. But those junior staff that perhaps haven't, either by their own volition or by their environmental, their socioeconomic upbringing, they may not have engaged in these types of tools before, and they're experiencing these challenges for the very first time. This is the earliest point in their career, and this is having an effect on them. And the long-term effect of that is not known to us at the moment. But how did you see the results come through for junior staff? Because from what I read, they were a bit of an anomaly in the fact that they were very unique in how fewer experiences they had prior to the situations that we've experienced, and now the detrimental effect it's probably going to have on them long-term, not just over this past 18 months.
Yeah. So when we first started, we actually started this work well before the pandemic. The pandemic sort of accelerated the work that we were doing. But when we started it, the particular study that we were looking at was called First Workers and First Responders. And what you're talking about is actually people who are first workers and first responders. So they've got both of those, because we were looking at that transition into work is very difficult. And then we knew that those first responders were also in a challenging situation. We did some work with the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, very kindly allowed us to share some of the work that we were doing. And we saw, coming out of the first phase, kind of the first peak of the pandemic, what we noticed in our numbers was that the more junior staff were struggling the most coming out of that first wave. And so the college, to their absolute kind of, I don't know what applaud, what's the word, to their credit. They actually noticed that, and they started to put in some peer support because they saw it in the data that we were saying. We said, hey, here is a group of people who are struggling. They put in peer support. They started to look at ways in which they could get those communities together, where they could share experience. I mean, it made sense. During that first wave, they probably weren't getting the kind of support that they would get from the more experienced seniors, because those people were time poor and they were fighting.
Yeah.
So they did that, and actually over a 4-month period, we actually saw just by engaging and recognizing that as an issue, they actually, by the time we got to September, which was sort of, we got through the summer period, they were actually the strongest cohort. Yeah, because we were able to show, and we do a lot of measurement and ongoing, and it was incredible for us to see. One was, here was a perfect use of looking at some data, spotting an issue, engaging with that, and then seeing the positive results. Because those individuals, had we just let them drift, may have that may have forced them out of the profession, or they may have suffered more significant mental health issues. But we were able to do that. So those first workers who are first responders, that has been a difficult time. But I'd say that, again, techniques around just building self-awareness. If you're a more senior person within your service, then just make sure that you just reaching out, just asking that question, making sure, because they don't have the experience to fall back on. And some of them might be wondering, what the hell did I get myself into? This was not what it's like. And my daughter, my daughter works for the NHS, and she started work in during the pandemic.
Wow.
And, I talk to her all the time, because some days she finds it difficult, like we all do. Some days are pretty difficult, but she doesn't have that sort of fallback experience to say, actually, it's going to get better. So we do need to make sure that we look after that cohort, because we have seen them struggle with just kind of how to cope with some of the things that their more experienced people know what to do.
Now, you said there about how senior people in the organizations and leaders in general can try and create these sort of strategies or connections or sort of working groups to try and give people that level of support. But there's also an aspect that can't necessarily be done inside of work. And again, when we talk about self-awareness and self-accountability, something that we've got to try and discipline, which again sounds a horrible word to some people, ourselves, about sort of work-life boundaries and or balance and empowering staff about their own self-care when they're not at work. But with our emails on our phones and things like that, what are we realistically trying to look at when we talk about that work-life balance or boundaries, and how do we see that manifesting in organizations?
I think that every individual is different and wants to have their own boundaries between work and life, work and life, work and sort of their personal life. And I've seen organizations say, we're going to ban emails after 6 o'clock, or there'll be no emails on a weekend or whatever. And I think, well, who are you to tell me when I want to work and when I don't want to work?
Yeah.
Because if I'm a single parent and I need to pick up my kids from school at 3:30, but then nanny comes round at 7, or granny or grandpa or whoever, and so I need to take time out from 3 till 4, but I work that time from 6 till 7 when granny's around looking after the kids or whatever.
Yeah.
That, for me, is a perfect work-life balance, because that is suiting my life. So I think leaders have to be cognizant of the differences within their workforce. And this is why we do a lot of work, because our data shows, and it's all anonymous, by the way. We never identify any individual. It's all aggregated at 25 is our aggregation limit.
Yeah.
But we can show up differences, as you see in our report, between males and females, but age groups. But we also look at seniority. We're now looking at things. If you look at our gender research, we can now highlight issues around the gender pay gap. Maybe not so relevant within some of the government services because it's fairly well, maybe not very generous. It's fairly well known. But the data will show those kinds of things. I think the importance for leadership is to really understand your culture, your organization, and to make sure that you set boundaries for that and don't try and force people into one way of working or another, because you'll get the most out of each individual when you can give them some flexibility. Now, within the emergency services, a lot of shift work.
Yeah.
What I think is that when schedules of work, when processes were developed, when ways of working were developed, they were generally developed at a time when mental well-being wasn't a thing.
No.
So they were generally developed for organizations to operate efficiently and sort of maybe not with the person in mind. But shift work is incredibly difficult. We know that actually one of the areas where mental health comes under pressure is where you have a loss of control, particularly if you're a shift work and you don't know when that shift might end. So you don't know if you're going to get to read your daughter or son a book or see your partner or go out and play football with your mates or go and play tennis or whatever you want to do, that loss of control. And so we're asking organizations to think about the structure of their work and take the employee into consideration, because actually what you will find is when you redevelop some of those processes, you probably make, one, your employees a lot more happy and a lot more focused on what they're doing, and who doesn't want to be happier? And you get your stuff done better, and you probably get away through some of the things that maybe make you angry, where you have to stand to the side of the road. It's kind of looking at those systems. That work-life balance is not about closing down emails at a certain time, but understanding the individual and all of the individuals within your organization and helping them find the right thing that is right for them and their personal situation.
I often say, certainly from a smaller example, just from our watch that I have on my station, that we have metrics to hit, but for all intents and purpose, between the parameters of our 12-hour shift, we're in control. We can set the game up to win. We can decide when we want to have lunch. We can decide when we want to go and do these risk visits, and fire calls and emergency calls will come up as and when they do. But you can set the game up to win if you feel like you set these non-negotiable fixed things in place, because you start to, like you say, slowly bleed away those aspects of control, and you don't have to have many points of control in order to at least feel like you've got some sort of anchoring and a handle on you've got an influence. You're part of the decision making process. You're not being dictated to, and like you say, all of that control has not been taken away from you.
Yeah, empowering your employees. Yeah, sure, you need structure and you need boundaries, but a little bit of trust goes a long, long way.
Now, you said about a lot of these structures and a lot of these ways of working being put in place when it was all about efficiency, and there's certainly some aspects still of that existing, and so it should. Otherwise, things aren't affordable, things don't become sustainable. But one of the things that I found really interesting when I was looking through the report, and also some stuff that I've interacted with in different emergency services, is this aspect of monitoring rest and recovery, and how we can analyse that. And there's a brigade in the UK, a fire service, that has been issuing wearable tech for people's health. Now, I've had something called a Whoop strap in the past, where it measures my rest and recovery, and it really did give me some stark surprises about how little I was getting, and how sometimes I was actually overtraining or overexerting myself. Someone that thought of myself to be quite fit and healthy, the amount of sleep and rest and recovery and heart rate variability and all this sort of stuff that I wasn't getting was very detrimental to my health. What's your thoughts on people using, or organizations using, wearable tech? Do you think it's good? Do you think we'll paint ourselves into a corner? Are we worried about what might come out of Pandora's box if we go down that sort of alleyway?
It's a very interesting question. I'm a technologist by training, right? So I love technology, and I have pretty much every device known to mankind, much to the annoyance of my partner.
Yeah.
But I always go back to sort of personal choice. I think technology is a great enabler, and measurement and just making sure you know where you are, and that has propelled us forward as a human race, actually, knowledge and understanding of different things. So I am for it if there's some personal choice involved. Where I find that it becomes difficult, and where I find people find it difficult, is where it's mandated and they don't understand what it's for.
Yes.
So when we first worked with one of our early clients and we talked to their employees, we said, well, we want to share some aggregated data with your employer. They said, no, definitely not. Never in a million years. I will never sign up to this. Because they didn't really understand how it was used. When we sort of dug away at it, they said, well, actually, we think that this is just going to be another way for them to decide, who to fire next.
Yeah.
So we had to, but when we really spoke to them about, actually, no, this is an organization that's actually caring about you and is trying to get some data. Here are the things that we are going to share. They said, oh, I do want my employer to know that stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you've got to be really transparent around what the organization is getting out of it and what they're using it for, because people will naturally be distrustful. And I think in some areas of the emergency services, trust is an issue.
Definitely.
Without me getting too specific. And so I think that's really important that trust is built, because otherwise people become very skeptical, and then you don't get the engagement, and then you don't get the benefit.
I don't think there'll be anybody debating the data in any of this, but there's an aspect of me that, from my limited perception of the way that we are measured as an emergency services, and with a lot of frontline services going through auditing processes, Her Majesty's Inspectorate needs to make sure that all the pennies from the generous public is going to the right places. If we do start connecting these well-being metrics to the organization's performance, if we're using a key performance indicator as the staff's well-being, is the concerns, or have you heard any concerns expressed by leaders in the sector about how this is going to make them look? Because if we say that so much of the frontline services are struggling from mental health, it's not a fantastic recruitment pitch.
No, I think so. We have spoken to, of course, a lot of leaders across all sorts of industries about how they feel about it, and I think the financial services industry, one particular leader said to us, well, I don't want to know this, because if I know it, I'll have to do something about it.
That's it.
And that, when we first heard that, for us, was quite shocking, because we were like, oh, well, why wouldn't you want to know this? And of course you want to know this, because you want to make sure that your workforce are happy and engaged, and you've got the right things in place. So we do see pockets of that for sure. However, maybe it's just the organizations that we get to talk to, but we certainly see way more organizations who are saying, actually, this is important to us. The pandemic has brought this absolutely into the kind of critical side of what it is. Well-being is not a sort of nice to have. It's an actual must-have. It's a bit like health and safety. I mean, 100 years ago, health and safety was not a thing. Today, it's an absolute must-have, and there's laws and regulations, and quite right too, because it saves a lot of lives and a lot of injury. And we want to do that. And psychological safety of people is also hyper important. And I suspect,
I'd argue we're going to save more lives through this, with all due respect.
Yeah, and I really hope that some of the work that that we're doing, that many other organizations are doing. People will look back in 100 years and say, oh, great pioneering, because we really were able to bring the psychological safety and make sure that people got taken care of, and society generate benefits as a whole. So we are seeing organizations now who are really leaning into this. The issue that many of them have is that they don't know what to do. It was actually the chairman of Barclays who said, if you don't have data, you don't have anything. Because if you don't have data, you don't know where you start. You don't know what direction you should be heading. So you're going to be guessing at stuff. And so we would say, do a little bit of research, understand what's right for your culture, because, and in emergency services, cultures will be very different based on, urban situation, roles, all sorts of things. I mean, if you're in the mountains as a police officer or a firefighter, then it's very different than if you're in central London. So get to know your culture and your organization. And it's not scary, it's not expensive. You can just get a baseline and understand where you are versus others, and then do the practical things that will help the workforce. And we're not saying change your processes, but what we're saying is look at them, consider the human in those, and to see if there are areas where you can make improvements. And because we're always looking for improvement. So that's our sort of,
I think because there's so many people doing it as well. There's so many people that are interested in this now. There will be, and there is, a lot of low-hanging fruit. And not that I'm referring to your resources necessarily as low-hanging fruit, but there are a lot of relatively inexpensive things, whether it's getting support from people like 87% or something like that. They're not colossal shifts. And like you said, I think there is a number of people that do want to know. It just, when you do see it in data, as you referred to the Barclays quote there, it takes away that level of detachment. I forget what study it was where they had an individual questioning people, and every time they would get the question wrong, they'd receive a small electric shock. And the person getting the electric shock was, it was not very ethical at the time, I think, or now we certainly wouldn't be allowed to do it. But the person getting shocked was an actor. And every time they got the question wrong, they would slowly increase the voltage. Now, if the person was in the room with them and they could see the damage that their actions were taking, they were more inclined to say, stop, I don't want to carry on. I don't like doing this. But if the person was in another room and they couldn't hear them and they couldn't see them, they were able to administer some fairly lethal shocks of electricity to people because they'd had that level of detachment. And I think the emergency services and frontline workers in general, it tends to be quite good people that gravitate to that field. I can only speak from a personal perspective. I didn't necessarily join it for the money. It's an okay income, but I've not managed to pay off the yacht yet, put it that way. So I think people do want to see this data, and then it allows them to start that sort of plan, do, check, act cycle of let's capture some of this low-hanging fruit. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's check the response, and then let's take action on those responses and go back around the cycle again.
Yeah, you're exactly right. A little bit of insight allows you to at least make a conscious decision to make an action or not make an action. But you at least want to have that conscious decision. And I actually saw that piece of research about the electric shock, and it, when you were talking about it, made me smile, because there's also a Simpsons episode where they play out that very experiment.
Oh, really?
One of the funniest. Yeah, it's very funny because you can imagine what Homer Simpson does with that.
Yeah, just start cranking it up.
Yeah, exactly right.
Now, just a few final acknowledgements as well, because as part of this whole thing, the Aviva Foundation provided a lot of funding for a range of support services that now are out there sort of for the national frontline workforce. What kind of services did this fund? And then I want us to go on to speak about how 87% are working with people at the minute. So how did the Aviva Foundation get involved, and what have we seen come out of that?
The Aviva Foundation, firstly, has been magnificent, absolutely amazing in their support of frontline workers. And actually, they, as soon as the pandemic hit, Aviva came to us and said, how can we increase the amount of support that we can give to frontline workers? We have a platform that provides access to existing areas of support If you think about our platform as being one, it helps people really understand who they are and measure themselves. We see that the majority of people do not need therapy, and unfortunately, it's not unfortunate actually that the industry has started making sure that they get support to those people who need it absolutely critical. But what we're now trying to do is to help the majority of us who don't need therapy understand how we never get into that situation or how we reduce the likelihood of that.
Yeah.
And the Aviva Foundation were able to help us give that platform to, we have around about 60,000 people with access to the platform right across. I think I talked about Royal College of Emergency Medicine, but we work with some of the ambulance services. I mentioned Air Ambulance. We do College of Paramedics. We actually work with a company called Practitioner Health. They are the EAP, Emergency Employee Assistance Program, but they help all of the 190,000 doctors and dentists in this country understand and make sure that they're on top of their themselves as they care for us. So we have a program where actually the platform is available to those organizations, and Aviva funded that to begin with. Now many of those organizations, I'm glad to say, are funding themselves, so a good testament, I think, to the value that we're providing to them. But Aviva continues to support us, and we're always grateful for that. But it's a case of sort of coming to us and talking to us. Actually, at this point, all of that funding has been deployed. So, and that's where we've got sort of 50, 60,000 people on the platform or with access to the platform.
It's really reassuring
unfortunately,
that it didn't sort of go to waste. You've got a fantastic piece of data, and you've created some wonderful resources at the back end of it as well. So it's not like you hear of every now and again where a problem has arisen and it's grown and grown and grown in its magnitude. We throw money at it, but we don't seem to get anything out the other end. It seems great that we've actually got some tangible data that is acting as like a lever of change in the sector.
Yes, and we continue to work within this. So we will do an update of this report. We'll be working with the leadership on what their specific data is telling them. We are lucky enough, we work with Police Scotland, and and we work with them, and they're doing some great work now in really understanding what that data is telling them for the work that they're doing. I give them a lot of praise for doing that. So it's now about the data is just the first step. It just lets you know where to start. Once you get on top of that, then you can make an informed well-being strategy. You can then deploy resources when you think the greatest benefit is. You can then measure the impact of that. If it's not having the impact that you thought it was going to have, then I say put the money back in your pocket, rethink about how to attack that particular issue, and then go again. Because we want to make sure that people who work in these services get the best care and have the best work environment to help them do the job that they do, because everybody in society wants that. Because while we hope that we never need the emergency services, we're very, very glad when they're there. And we want them to be, as well looked after as possible.
We've got to look after the people that are looking after us at the end of the day. But
yeah,
for anybody that's not read it, obviously we're going to put it all in the notes below so they can go on and they can download the report. It's actually, even for a knuckle-dragging gym monkey like myself, it is very readable. They didn't use too many big words that I wasn't taught at school. So people can access this, and it does give me some real reassurance that people such as yourself, Dr. Pitts, are being able to continue this, because we've shown that people are coming on board with it, people are seeing the importance of it. We're starting to weave it into I hate to use the word, the corporate strategies and the overarching sort of code of ethics and core values that we're seeing in a lot of organizations now, and that people are seeing a tangible return on that investment, even though these, for some people, are still softer aspects of work life, that, developing that emotional intelligence in the workforce as a whole. But it reassures me that you're doing it. And I want to thank you for putting the study together.
Yeah, thank you. And we do see results. Some of the numbers that we get, we see significant reduction in people off sick.
Mm.
Well, that boils down to people who are not sick. Well, I don't want to be sick. I don't enjoy being sick. So if I can reduce that in any way, so there are some. It's not just sort of results for the organization, because when you break down those results, it's actually results for the individual.
Yeah.
The individuals are benefiting from now. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to say individuals are responsible for their well-being, but the organization has resources at its fingertips that are maybe not accessible for individuals, and so therefore the organization has a responsibility
Absolutely.
to help that individual. And when those two things work together, it really is a beautiful thing, because the organization benefits, the individual benefits, and that is what propels society forward.
I love it. Andy, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be here with us. And again, we will share everything with regard to the study itself, how people can draw greater resources and get in contact with 87% in terms of putting together their strategies of how they can actually put the rubber to the road and implement some of these things.
It's about making change. If nothing changes, nothing changes.